इस वीडियो में हम देखेंगे एंटमैन 1, एंटमैन 2, एंटमैन 3 सभी देशों से होने वाली बॉक्स ऑफिस कलेक्शन। मूवी एंटमैन 1, एंटमैन 2, एंटमैन 3। बजट एंटमैन 1 $130 million, एंटमैन 2 $180 million, एंटमैन 3 $200 million। Director Ant-Man 1 Peyton Reed, Ant-Man 2 Peyton Reed, Ant-Man 3 Peyton Reed। Released date Ant-Man 1 24th July 2015, Ant-Man 2 13th July 2018, Ant-Man 3 17th February 2023। Running time Ant-Man 1 1 hours 57 minutes, Ant-Man 2 1 hours 58 minutes, Ant-Man 3 2 hours 5 minutes। IMDb rate Ant-Man 1 7.3 out of 10, Ant-Man 2 7 out of 10, Ant-Man 3 6.5 out of 10। Box office collection country-wise. In USA, Ant-Man 1 is $180.2 million, Ant-Man 2 is $216.6 million, Ant-Man 3 is $171.3 million। In France, Ant-Man 1 is $13.5 million, Ant-Man 2 is $14.7 million, Ant-Man 3 is $9.2 million। In Germany, Ant-Man 1 is $5.9 million, Ant-Man 2 is $9.4 million, Ant-Man 3 is $7.4 million। In UK, Ant-Man 1 is $25.1 million, Ant-Man 2 is $22.9 million, Ant-Man 3 is $17.6 million। In Spain, Ant-Man 1 is $4.1 million, Ant-Man 2 is $6.8 million, Ant-Man 3 is $3.9 million। In Italy, Ant-Man 1 is $5.2 million, Ant-Man 2 is $5.8 million, Ant-Man 3 is $5 million। In Netherlands, Ant-Man 1 is $1.8 million, Ant-Man 2 is $2.6 million, Ant-Man 3 is $2.3 million। In Switzerland, Ant-Man 1 is $1.2 million, Ant-Man 2 is $1.2 million, Ant-Man 3 is $1 million। In Poland, Ant-Man 1 is $1.3 million, Ant-Man 2 is $2.4 million, Ant-Man 3 is $1.5 million। In Belgium, Ant-Man 1 is $1.2 million, Ant-Man 2 is $1.3 million, Ant-Man 3 is $1.3 million। In Austria, Ant-Man 1 is $0.7 million, Ant-Man 2 is $1.5 million, Ant-Man 3 is $1.1 million। In Denmark, Ant-Man 1 is $0.9 million, Ant-Man 2 is $1 million, Ant-Man 3 is $0.9 million। In Sweden, Ant-Man 1 is $2.1 million, Ant-Man 2 is $1.9 million, Ant-Man 3 is $1.1 million. In UAE, Ant-Man 1 is $2.8 million. Ant-Man 2 is $3.2 million. Ant-Man 3 is $1.4 million. In Czech Republic, Ant-Man 1 is $0.6 million. Ant-Man 2 is $1.1 million. Ant-Man 3 is $0.9 million. In Norway, Ant-Man 1 is $1.3 million. Ant-Man 2 is $1.4 million. Ant-Man 3 is $0.7 million. In Turkey, Ant-Man 1 is $1.5 million. Ant-Man 2 is $1.1 million. Ant-Man 3 is $1.2 million. In Portugal, Ant-Man 1 is $0.7 million. Ant-Man 2 is $0.9 million. Ant-Man 3 is $0.3 million. In Venezuela, Ant-Man 1 is $6.7 million. Ant-Man 2 is $3.4 million. Ant-Man 3 is not known. In Finland, Ant-Man 1 is $0.5 million. Ant-Man 2 is $0.7 million. Ant-Man 3 is $0.5 million. In South Africa, Ant-Man 1 is $0.7 million. Ant-Man 2 is $1.3 million. Ant-Man 3 is not known. In Iceland, Ant-Man 1 is $0.2 million. Ant-Man 2 is $0.2 million. Ant-Man 3 is $0.1 million. In Mexico, Ant-Man 1 is $15.1 million. Ant-Man 2 is $14.9 million. Ant-Man 3 is $13.1 million. In Brazil, Ant-Man 1 is $12.1 million. Ant-Man 2 is $13 million. Ant-Man 3 is $7.8 million. In Argentina, Ant-Man 1 is $4.1 million. Ant-Man 2 is $2.2 million. Ant-Man 3 is $2.8 million. In Colombia, Ant-Man 1 is $1.8 million. Ant-Man 2 is $2.9 million. Ant-Man 3 is $2.1 million. In Chile, Ant-Man 1 is $1.2 million. Ant-Man 2 is $2.4 million. Ant-Man 3 is $2.2 million. In South Korea, Ant-Man 1 is $21.1 million. Ant-Man 2 is $42.3 million. Ant-Man 3 is $10.5 million. In Australia, Ant-Man 1 is $10.9 million. Ant-Man 2 is $14.7 million. Ant-Man 3 is $8 million. In India, Ant-Man 1 is $1.6 million. Ant-Man 2 is $6.3 million. Ant-Man 3 is $5.3 million. In Japan, Ant-Man 1 is $9.6 million. Ant-Man 2 is $11.5 million. Ant-Man 3 is $5.4 million. In Taiwan, Ant-Man 1 is $11.1 million. Ant-Man 2 is $9.7 million. Ant-Man 3 is $3.1 million. In Russia, Ant-Man 1 is $11.5 million. Ant-Man 2 is $13 million. Ant-Man 3 is not known. In Hong Kong, Ant-Man 1 is $6.9 million. Ant-Man 2 is $7.6 million. Ant-Man 3 is $3 million. In Thailand, Ant-Man 1 is $3.3 million. Ant-Man 2 is $5.2 million. Ant-Man 3 is $2.9 million. In Malaysia, Ant-Man 1 is $6.7 million. Ant-Man 2 is $5.7 million. Ant-Man 3 is $3.6 million. In New Zealand, Ant-Man 1 is $0.7 million. Ant-Man 2 is $1.9 million. Ant-Man 3 is $1.1 million. In Vietnam, Ant-Man 1 is $2 million. Ant-Man 2 is not known. Ant-Man 3 is $1.6 million. In Philippines, Ant-Man 1 is $5.2 million. Ant-Man 2 is $5.8 million. Ant-Man 3 is $3.2 million. In Singapore, Ant-Man 1 is $4.5 million. Ant-Man 2 is $4 million. Ant-Man 3 is $2.3 million. In China, Ant-Man 1 is $105.3 million. Ant-Man 2 is $121.2 million. Ant-Man 3 is $31.4 million. Domestic collection. Ant-Man 1 is $180.2 million. Ant-Man 2 is $216.64 million. Ant-Man 3 is $172.8 million. International collection. Ant-Man 1 is $339.1 million. Ant-Man 2 is $406 million. Ant-Man 3 is $196.1 million. Total collection worldwide. Ant-Man 1 is $519.3 million. Ant-Man 2 is $622.6 million. Ant-Man 3 is $369 million. Thank you so much. Have a good day.